get to this story about RFK Jr. and black voters. Holy smokes. So this one actually caught me by surprise, but I did a deeper dive into this, and I think I know what's happening. So if you have not heard, it appears that RFK Jr. is not only winning support from young voters between the ages of 18 to 34. I can talk about that a little bit later. But apparently now, RFK Jr. is gaining support among black voters, particularly in the battleground states. Let's go ahead and get into this discussion here from Morning Joe, where they are freaking out. Shout out to Case Study QB for this clip. Let's do the damn thing.
All right. So let's talk about these polls that taken a year out from the election that, I would say don't really mean anything on who's going to ultimately win. But if I were,
what are they? A snapshot
snapshot of where people are right now. But if I were on the Biden campaign or any campaign that got these type of polls, I'd love them, because I would be using them to get everybody working from the top to bottom, get them working as hard as they can to double their efforts on these areas that there's some, we're seeing some softness again a year out. So these are actually, somebody said this yesterday, and I'm sure Jim Messina and others who come on the show would say the same thing. Use these polls as a way to inspire your troops to work harder, work longer, campaign more, especially when you got an autocrat running against you and nothing short of American democracy's on the line. If that can't inspire you,
I don't know what does, but
go into professional bowling.
The polling shows President Biden is losing support among black voters. The White House is vowing not to, quote, make the mistake of underestimating a key group that helped propel Biden to victory in 2020.
A key group that helped propel Democrat presidents in my adult lifetime, all of them to victory. So this isn't new news. We have been seeing this over the past year, that black support for Joe Biden has continued to decrease. So this isn't a new thing. And I want you to know that Joe, I think his name is Joe and Mika, these are very wealthy people. They're well off. They're very privileged. They have nothing to gain. Well, they have more to gain, excuse me. They still can have more to gain within their careers, but they don't have anything to lose. These people are very well off. Amika, if I remember correctly, I think her dad also worked in DC spaces. She was already deeply entrenched in DC politics. So these people, just keep in mind where the message is coming from.
In a new interview with NBC News, Biden's principal deputy campaign manager acknowledged that for the president to win again in 2024, his team, quote, has to have a long, sustained conversations with African Americans in their communities and can't simply, quote, parachute in around election time.
No.
This comes after a recent survey from the New York Times and Siena College showed Biden's seating support from black battleground state voters to Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
Okay, so this is what's happening here. Apparently, some of the black voter support that originally was for Joe Biden is now going to RFK Jr. Now, I want to point out something else. Some of that support has also gone to Donald Trump. Now, again, this is the battleground states, okay? So at one point, Donald Trump had like 8% of the black vote on a national level. Then he had like 11% approval of black voters earlier this year on the national level. Now we are seeing Donald Trump has 13% of black support in those battleground states. So this is going to be very telling, especially if RFK Jr. stays in the race the entire time. He is getting that support. Some of those black supporters in those states that did support Joe Biden are now supporting RFK Jr. I have a theory about this, but I want to let this play a little bit more.
For more on that, let's bring in opinion editor at the Washington Post, Alexi McCammond. Her latest piece is entitled, Democrats Need to Get Real, about RFK Jr.'s strength with black voters. Alexi, where is it coming from?
Hey, well, thank you so much for having me. I mean, I think what Joe said is right. So a couple of disclaimers off the top. Polls are not gospel. It's a year out, and black voters are not a monolith. But one thing that is clear in polling trends, focus group trends, and otherwise is that black voters and other voters are looking for an alternative. Black voters have long felt and said and showed us that they feel taken for granted by the Democratic Party. We've seen the ways in which VP Harris hasn't been supported as much as some folks would like by the Democratic Party, by President Biden. And the real kicker with RFK Jr., and something that is particularly unique to him, is that he taps into this deep-seated, deep-rooted medical skepticism that a lot of black folks across the country feel, rightfully so. There has been medical racism going back, to the 1800s through now. There is ample reason why folks might feel distrustful of their healthcare providers or of what even the government is telling us we should do with our bodies with respect to vaccines. Now, that is not to say that everything RFK Jr. says about vaccines is directly appealing to black voters, but when he talks about these things and brings up the idea that actually maybe they're lying to you or maybe you shouldn't take this vaccine, he's really trying to get at what other folks aren't saying to these voters, which is...
I'm sorry. I'm just going to pause there for a second. I don't think that is really the reason. That may have something to do with it, but I think we have to think about it like this. If you're unhappy with the job that Joe Biden has done, if you're unhappy economically in this country, which is the number one thing that voters who are polled are concerned about, is the economy. So if your financial well-being is worse now under Joe Biden than it was under Donald Trump, and you are African American and you're looking to move away from Joe Biden and you don't want to vote for him again in 2024, well, then you start to look around at the other options, right? One of the things, and we're going to debunk this tonight, because one of the things that is going around, particularly on social media, is that RFK Jr. has a reparations plan, that he supports reparations. So what he support, we're going to talk about what he actually supports and what he does not support. So there's a difference between what black people those who are actually asking for reparations, there's a difference between those who have that lineage, what they're asking for, and what RFK Jr.'s reparations plan is. So we're going to debunk that tonight. We're going to break that down because people are not telling the truth. And I have the video footage to show it with him saying this himself. So that could also be part of the reason why some of those voters may be finding RFK Jr. more appealing. So let's continue.
I hear you. I see you. I understand why you might feel this way.
Rev, curious about your thoughts. I know you have a question for Alexi, but first, can you respond to that about Kennedy playing into a deep skepticism that a lot of members of the black community have of the medical community?
No, he has definitely played into that, and there is definitely a skepticism, no matter how much we may feel that it is unfounded. People have real skepticism based on history, Tuskegee experiment just being one, about vaccines, and Robert Jr. has played into that. He's also been one that's been a hero in the environmental movement, environmental racism, that many of us supported his raising that prior to his running.
That's the other reason that I was going to mention as well. His experience as an environmental lawyer, working in those particular areas where they were affected by environmental pollution, not just in the United States, but across the world. He's gone to Latin America as well. That's another key thing that may be moving some people over. But I think, again, if you're upset with Joe Biden's job and financially, your financial well-being is worse now than it was under Donald Trump, but you don't want to vote for Donald Trump. Obviously, if you still want to vote, you're going to start looking elsewhere. There could also be the fact that his last name is Kennedy. So some people who may not be really familiar with RFK Jr., they see the name Kennedy and it's like, oh, a Kennedy. So that's something else that's come across that I've noticed in discussions that I've been having with people as well. Like I'll tell people, oh, did you know all these different people are running for president? When I would get to RFK Jr.'s name, they would say, oh, okay, oh, a Kennedy. But I realized a lot of the people that I was talking to didn't actually know who RFK Jr. was. They just heard Kennedy. And that was appealing to them. So there's the Kennedy name recognition as well.
Having said that, Alexi, the fact that a lot of the bizarre stuff, both politically as well as in terms of policy, that Robert has brought out has not been really confronted or countered by the Biden administration. So don't you think that some of what Robert's growing popularity or growing support among some blacks is because he's not been challenged by the Biden supporters on some of the things that he says that are completely out of line with the way a lot of blacks think?
But he has been challenged, though. He has been challenged. When he first announced his campaign, he was challenged on CNN. He's not challenged as much on Fox News because they seem to like a lot of his policies, but he has been challenged. I will say, though, particularly when we look at the progressive platforms, he has not really appeared on most of the progressive platforms. He has not appeared on Useful Idiots, The Gray Zone, Katie Halper Show. He has not appeared on Bad Faith. And this is not to say these things will not happen. But I do know that there are people within this space that have reached out multiple times to have him come on to the show. People who are left commentators, and there is either no response or there's the response like what Max Blumenthal received, right? Where it's like, no, it's not happening. So he seems to be somewhat avoiding people who are going to be very knowledgeable about this issue of Israel and Gaza. He is avoiding those shows. And I said before, I think that's a mistake, but it appears to me that RFK Jr. is not trying to go after the progressive left vote. It seems like he's trying to go after the independents, maybe some of the libertarians, and some of the people that voted for Trump but don't want to vote for Trump again this time around. Since he has left the Democratic Party as a candidate and he has announced his candidacy as an independent, he has increased in the polls. So this is different from what we may have seen in the past. This exact same thing could have happened to Bernie Sanders if he were willing to have left the Democratic Party, which is what we wanted him to do, and run as an independent when they cheated him in 2016. So this is something that I want you to be aware of. This is the same type of support that Bernie Sanders could have had if he ran as an independent, actually possibly even more support. The fact that RFK Jr. is sitting over 15%, his numbers have increased and he's an independent. If we were going into the debates today, he's already eligible to be on the debate stage. And if he is on the debate stage, that is going to be a problem for Joe Biden. It is just a reality. Listen, I'm not voting for RFK Jr. I don't like his position on Israel and Palestine. It is what it is. I don't like the fact that his reparations policy is not what people really want in reference to reparations. So he's not my candidate. But the reality is, right now, he is the most, I would say, right now, if the election were today, he is the independent or third party / candidate that is going to really have an impact on this election. The numbers do not lie. And I don't say that lightly. Like, again, he is not my candidate. But the reality is, based on the numbers, based on the support that he is getting right now, he is a threat to both Joe Biden and to Donald Trump.
I think yes and no. Yes, because when he was briefly running in the Democratic primary against Biden, he was getting a lot of attention. We were all giving him a lot of attention for, the things he was saying at private dinners and otherwise about vaccines, casting doubt on these things, and about some of the more outlandish views he had. And that obviously dipped support with some Democratic voters at the time. I think the smartest thing he's done is get out of that primary and run as an independent, because it takes the heat off of him from the major parties. I know that Joe Biden's campaign doesn't even really want to take him seriously. They think and maintain that voters will see this as a two-person race between Biden and Donald Trump. Everything suggests otherwise at this point, that voters are looking for alternatives, that they want it to be anyone but Biden and Trump. And I think that, Black voters are hearing a lot from RFK Jr. about other things beyond vaccines. And I think that's the big issue. He's couching a lot of this stuff in terms of civil rights, as I'm sure you know, Rev. And he's also talking a lot like Milei, who was just elected in Argentina, this sort of populist rhetoric that's painting a very hopeful vision for the future. And he's not really focusing on those other sort of outlandish things. And so to your point, sure, maybe if Democrats focused on those things, people would be more aware and maybe reconsider or think more holistically about who he is. But he's really staying away from those things. And the Biden campaign so far is sort of considering him as a non-starter.
Well, the Biden campaign should start to think again, because he is going to be a threat. I just want to show you this here because I saw someone questioning Donald Trump's support. So I just want to show you something and I'll go back to the video because I seem to remember this very well. Even though Donald Trump lost in 2020, Donald Trump did make gains with the Black vote. Look at this here. Vox had reported on this after the election. Trump made gains with Black voters in some states. And I just want to point out this part right here. Trump won 8% of the Black vote, about a 2 percentage point gain on his 2016 numbers. So that's important for people to understand. Even though Donald Trump lost in 2020, he still gained support among Black voters. And now his approval rating seems to be higher among Black voters. Let's go ahead and get back into this video here.
Jonathan, let me hear a few things. First of all, there is the obstacle of Robert Kennedy Jr. getting on the ballot on a lot of states. We'll actually see as we move forward whether he's going to be able to do that or not. As an independent, he certainly has more time to clear the hurdles if he decides that he wants to do that. But I find Alexi's reporting fascinating because you actually have Kennedy. You have two stories here, a tale of two stories. One, he takes away from Donald Trump more than Biden in many polls that we've seen, despite the fact he takes one of the most critical electorates. He takes a good chunk of one of the most critical electorates away from Joe Biden. That is Black voters. Of course, it is early. And I suspect that what will happen this year is what happens every year, though there can be a change that people come home, whether it's young voters, whether it's people of color. All of these outlandish predictions I heard going into the 2020 election ended up being outlandish. I suspect the same will be true here, but the Biden.
The 2020, I'm sorry, that's not a good comparison. In the 2020 election, we did not have an independent candidate polling this high. Now, obviously, it is harder to get ballot access as an independent and as a third party candidate. But I don't think RFK Jr. is going to struggle the way that others may because he has the money. This is the piece that they're not mentioning on Morning Joe. Maybe they haven't paid attention to this yet, but I talked about his funding numbers and his donations and where the money's coming from. RFK Jr. is getting donations from billionaires. It's on the FEC report. You can go look this up yourself. He's getting donations from billionaires. So there's a lot of big money coming in. He has millions. He's raised millions and millions of dollars. So in order for him to get on the ballot, you got two options, right? You go through the signature process. You got to get people on the ground game going and people to gather those signatures, et cetera. But you can also buy your way onto the ballot, just like someone like Ross Perot. So RFK Jr., the amount of money that he has raised, he can buy his way onto the ballot in some of these states. And honestly, what he could be doing, and I'm not sure, but what he could be doing is he could be focusing strategically on those swing states. I know he's been in New Hampshire a lot. I'm in Massachusetts, is right to the north of me. So I know he's been in New Hampshire a lot. But one of the things I will say is that he hit the ground running from the moment that he announced his campaign. They organized people on the ground from the moment he announced his campaign. I will say that again, he is not my candidate. But when it comes to the organizing, he was on it. Now, things have happened. Dennis Kucinich left the campaign. He decided to hire his daughter-in-law as his new campaign manager. She's former CIA. We already talked about that. You know how I feel about that. But all in all, RFK Jr. has not decreased in the polls. He is increasing in the polls, and he already has a ground game. So I don't think he's going to run into as much trouble with the ballot access issue if he has the ground game and he already has millions of dollars.
Campaign does have to worry about this, don't they?
Biden campaign officials are deeply worried about third-party candidates. Though they don't want to give them much in the way of oxygen by talking about them, at least not now. Still believing that many of them will eventually drop out between now and when the ballots are actually cast. But you're right, RFK Jr. Appeals to sort of the conspiracy theorist group that draws from Trump. But yes, maybe black voters from Biden. And of course, he's not the only potential third-party candidate. Jill Stein, Cornel West, who might have some appeal to black voters. Joe Manchin is also considering getting in, maybe under the no labels banner. So
notice how they never mentioned Claudia De La Cruz or Dr. Shiva, who are also running outside the duopoly. Claudia De La Cruz is running through PSL and Dr. Shiva is running independent. It's interesting they don't mention their names, and it could be just because of name recognition. They're mentioning the names they know more people are going to be familiar with, but I just wanted to make sure I mentioned that as well.
Alexi, we know that the third-party candidates are a threat, but there's also an issue about enthusiasm, particularly among voters of color. That's something that the Biden team has struggled with. You know, even in 2020, they ran behind what previous Democrats have done. And I think there are real concerns about this time around as well. So in terms of Democratic officials you speak to, how worried are they? And what can the Biden team do to energize young voters, but particularly young voters of color?
Yeah, I mean, the statements from Quentin Fulks and others from the Biden campaign show that they are keenly aware of what they need to do, which is not take them for granted and not parachute in, as he said, in the 11th hour. That is clear. I think the problem is that a lot of this is sort of baked in the cake. I mean, like, you look at the relationship between Biden and VP Harris, and I know that a lot of black folks would have liked to see more support for her throughout this first term from Biden and other Democrats. And that's something you can't really undo. Biden also needs to give these folks a reason to be excited, a reason to vote for him. And a lot of voters are sick of casting a throwaway ballot, or what they say is a ballot for the lesser of two evils. And that's one of the big differences between, I think, 2016, 2020, and 2024. I think especially after the COVID pandemic, people feel much more individualistic. They're much more concerned about themselves than they are with group affiliation. That diminishes Democratic Party loyalty, that diminishes loyalty folks might have had to Biden in the past, thinking he would do the right thing. So it's more than just saying the right thing. And I think lastly, VP Harris has been the one, if you look at these same polls, who's keeping Biden in the game. I mean, she's getting support with younger voters, with voters of color, these constituencies that they need to win to keep that coalition together. That was surprising from those polls. I know that a lot of folks, we were sort of thinking she wouldn't have a strong coalition, just as she didn't in 2020. But she's been going on these college campus tours and talking to these people that the Biden folks need to do a better effort putting Biden in front of.
I'm sorry. People, black voters are not pulling away from Joe Biden because there's not enough attention being given to Kamala Harris. Black voters are pulling away from Joe Biden because economically we are struggling in this country. Because you made a lot of promises, Joe Biden, that you would do for the black community that you reneged. He promised that he would, basically cancel student loan debt for those that went to HBCUs that made under, I think it was $125,000, something like that. He promised that while he was running for president. That never happened. He promised that he would give those $2,000 checks to people in Georgia if they put Warnock and Ossoff in office. He shortchanged the checks and then tried to tell us we had already got part of the check from under Trump's administration. But you can give billions of dollars to Ukraine. You can give $8.3 billion to Israel every year. But when it comes to the American people, you promise us $2,000 checks and you shortchange the checks. And then not only that, some people didn't even get the checks. You can't continue to do this to black people and expect them to continue to come out and support you. And I said it before and I say it again. Barack Obama got 95% of the black vote in 2008. He got 93% for his reelection in 2012. Neither Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden have been able to come close to that. There is a reason for that. Now, don't get me wrong. Obama was also a con artist. He was able to win people over because he was a little bit more charismatic and he told us there was hope and there was change, but he was just bought and sold out as the rest of them. Now, I want to get to this clip as well, where it says, case study QB, thank you, asking if RFK Jr.'s growing support among blacks is because he hasn't been challenged by Biden supporters. One of the things it said here is, I think the smartest thing he's done is get out of the primary and run as an independent. I want to harp on this just again, one more second, because this is very important.
So don't you think that some of what Robert's growing popularity or growing support among some blacks is because he's not been challenged by the Biden supporters on some of the things that he says that are completely out of line with the way a lot of blacks think?
I think yes and no. Yes, because when he was briefly running in the Democratic primary against Biden, he was getting a lot of attention. We were all giving him a lot of attention for, the things he was saying at private dinners and otherwise about vaccines, casting doubt on these things, and about some of the more outlandish views he had. And that obviously dipped support with some Democratic voters at the time. I think the smartest thing he's done is get out of that primary and run as an independent, because
that part right there. Get out of the primary and run as an independent. And I did say, even at that point in time, again, I said he's not my candidate, but at that point in time, I did say that I applaud him for doing what Bernie Sanders did not have the guts to do, leaving the party and running as an independent. For years, we've heard that you couldn't do this because it would kill your campaign. Now we actually have something to point to and show that is not the case. That is not the case. I don't know why Marianne is still running the Democratic Party. Cenk Uygur, why are you running the Democratic Party? I don't know why these people have not left. Because at the end of the day, we already know the DNC is going to give the nomination to Joe Biden. We already know about the DNC fraud lawsuit. We already know the superdelegates pick who they want, regardless of who we want. So I don't even know why they're still in the Democratic primary race. The DNC is not going to give it to them. Now, there has been this video circulating around on Twitter for people saying RFK Jr. gained support among Black Americans because he has a reparations plan, because he supports reparations. But does RFK Jr. support the type of reparations that reparations activists within the Black community are actually calling for? No, he doesn't. And that's what people are leaving out. You see, I've seen this video. Let me pull this up here. I've seen this video. I watched the entire interview when it happened. So this is just a clip from the interview. The interview is much longer. Watch the entire thing. And it was really interesting to me. People are trying to tell me, look, Sabby, RFK Jr. supports reparations. Will you support him now? It's really weird how people are begging me to support this dude. I don't know. This is kind of weird. It giving me these weird vibes. Not knowing that I have actually already had watched the entire interview and I heard what he had to say when it came to cash reparations. This is what people need to hear. What RFK Jr. supports is fixing some of the structures, right? Fixing education, helping Black people get business loans, things like that. And I'm not saying those things don't need to happen. Yes, those things should happen. But RFK Jr. does not support cash reparations. And I'm going to show you why this is a problem based on what has happened in this country before historically. Let's get into it. This is the clip that everybody keeps saying, look, listen to what he says. Timestamp 6 minutes and 14 seconds. Listen.
I would be against cash. If there was no other issue, I would be against cash payment reparations. But
Let's hear that again. Timestamp 6 minutes. We'll go back a little bit, 13 seconds. Listen to this, people.
Well, I would be against cash. If there was no other issue, I would be against cash payment reparations. But the word reparation means repair. And, I grew up in a Jim Crow, and I saw this was not just the injury did not end with slavery. The injury and the deliberate suppression, the institutionalization of poverty in Black neighborhoods.
Now, RFK Jr., I'll play a little bit more. He's correct that it didn't end with slavery. He's correct that it also was an issue with Jim Crow. And I'd also add the crime bill, the war on drugs. But he knows all that. But RFK Jr. just told you he does not support cash-based reparations. Now, we're going to let him finish what he's saying. And then I'm going to fast forward to another piece of this discussion because they're actually going to respond to RFK Jr. There's a statement that he makes that kind of just threw people off a little bit. They're going to respond to him and tell them what they think. And then I'm going to show you why, based on history in this country, him not supporting cash reparations is a problem. Listen to this.
Is systematic, it's systemic, and it continues today in a million different ways. And we need to rebuild the Black communities. And so that, my approach to doing that would be to do it in a way that I think is going to be most effective, which is what we did at Bed-Stuy. We created what we call the Community Development Corporation there, and it is now the model for hundreds of community development corporations around the country because it works. And that it's less likely to contribute to the polarization between Blacks and whites because it benefits everybody. Everybody, even people who are Trumpers, who I see all the time because I represent them in lawsuits against big ballooners. If you talk about business loans to Black communities, everybody's for it. Everybody wants business to work and to flourish. And so for me, that would be my approach. To do everything I can to make, and I was in Cleveland.
We'll pause right there. Let's come out of this. So one of the reasons why he is against cash reparations is because other populations would have a problem with it. They're going to respond.
Reparations is about figuring out every way that we can to build Black-owned businesses back up. And if you talk about it in that way, it doesn't inspire the polarization and the racism that if you talk about cash reparations, that reaction.
I hear you, and I hear exactly where you're coming from. But I got to say, with all due respect, we in the Black community, I'll speak for myself, but I think there's other people I speak for too. We in the Black community are not really overly concerned about the feelings of other people who are polarized by the idea of us getting cash reparations back.
That's right. That piece right there. So here you have RFK Jr. basically trying to say to Black people what he thinks that we should have, and then tell us that we should not have cash reparations because other groups may have a problem with it. Look, people, criticize Marianne Williamson a lot, but one thing I will give her credit on this particular point is she has said time and time again, at least the very first time I interviewed her about reparations, she said it was not up to her to decide how the money should be spent. I'll give her credit for that. Now, based on what I've seen from other activists, her dollar amounts were not correct, but I'll give her credit for that, for saying that's not my decision. That's up for Black people to decide. But here's RFK Jr. telling Black people, this is what I think you should get. And I don't think that you should get cash reparations because, quote unquote, it'll be divisive when comparing it to other populations. So their response to them is, we're not really caring about that. We're not really caring about that.
If that hurts your feelings, that's kind of on you. And I'm not really, I'm also, just to continue to circle the wagons, I'm also not really overly interested in what's good for everybody when I start talking about reparations. When we start having that conversation, I'm concerned about what's good for the black people who have always been systemically behind the 8 ball.
Right.
Due to people who will deny that that system even exists. They'll tell you there is no systemic racism. They'll tell you need to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, which don't exist. That's
After they've stolen your boots, right?
but I'm not even wearing boots. So, please, I completely get what you're saying, and that is one way to do it. But I don't want our financial future, or not even, maybe not even financial future, but I don't want reparations contingent on how another group feels about it, or how another group is going to look at it or get upset about it. Like, I think maybe if we admit to the 800-pound gorilla in the room and what that represents and what it's done and what it's continuing to do, maybe now that it's out on the table, we can deal with it. And maybe reparations won't hurt so bad if we're not trying to rewrite the history. If we're not trying to pretend that these things don't exist, there is no systemic racism, you just need to work harder. You had a black president, so it's not that bad. Like, maybe if we knock that stuff off, reparations won't feel so bad if you get that we're really just paying back what we already said we were doing.
And one thing I want to add to, we need to talk about stolen labor. We need to talk about the fact that you had slaves in this country that worked for free. 400 years of slavery worked for free. And there were other companies that were later formed that profited from slavery. Free labor. So we wouldn't accept that today. I'm gonna let him finish, and then I'm gonna show you a time when nobody seemed to have it. It's a divisive issue when it happened before.
See it from both sides, but I do agree with Mac, because it's not like slavery benefited us. It didn't. So I feel like in the repair or the reparations of that, there shouldn't be a thought of anyone else and how they feel about it. However, I get what he's saying as far as what works over time, what is going to actually fix the community and not just seem like Christmas for 2 weeks and then it's back to regularly scheduled programming.
That's why I said I get it.
All right. So first and foremost, I think you need both. I think you can't just have the institutional repairs, like what RFK talked about, like the education system, the schools, the businesses, the business loans, like things like that. I'm not saying those things aren't an issue. Yes, the education system should be fixed. I told you guys before, the quickest way to do this is to, instead of having property taxes pay for public school funding, instead of doing that, you can do exactly what the U.S. government does for the Dodd schools that I attended when I was growing up, where the U.S. government, the federal government, funds those Dodd schools. And we had everything at those schools. So if the federal government can fund those Dodd schools, the federal government can fund the public schools, and everybody at public school in this country would have an equal resource education. Just like that. You got billions of dollars to send to Ukraine, you got billions of dollars to fund these public schools in this country, okay? Easy fix. Easy fix. But to go along with the institutional issues that he discussed, you still have to deal with the fact that you had stolen labor, which prevented most slaves in this country from establishing any type of land, and land equals wealth, or home ownership, which also equals wealth. therefore not having any land or home ownership to pass on to future generations. So you're starting from scratch. So the thing is this. I think you need both. But when RFK Jr. says other groups will have a problem with it, I want to show you a time when it seems like other groups didn't really have no problem with it. And this goes back to Ronald Reagan. So this is Ronald Reagan number 2 tonight. This right here. The redress and reparations for Japanese American incarceration. Not everyone knows about this. The Civil Liberties Act of 1988 gave surviving Japanese Americans reparations and a formal apology by President Reagan for their incarceration during World War II. Didn't happen overnight, it says. And here's the picture here. Share this with your friends, guys, because a lot of people don't know about this. Here's the picture here of Ronald Reagan. So we got 2 things Ronald Reagan did that I think a lot of people knew about. Number 1, he called for a ceasefire against Israel when Israel bombed Lebanon, something that Joe Biden will not do today. Number 2, he signed the Reparations Act for the Japanese Americans in this country. Yes, that happened under Ronald Reagan, a conservative president, and they got cash payments. Let's get into it. I'm going to jump down to this part right about here. I'm not going to read the whole article, but I can share the link in the chat. I want to get to the money part. Let me go down here. And it's talking about the story of Mass. She's talking about her experience. So it says here, let's highlight this for the folks in the back. Mass's experience led her to become a cynical social worker and participate in the redress movement that culminated with the passage of the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. Let me outline or highlight this part here. This law gave surviving Japanese Americans $20,000 in reparations and a formal apology by President Reagan for their incarceration during World War II. Somebody share that with RFK Jr. So, don't come to me with, we can't do the cash payments because then it'll be divisive. First of all, reparations is supposed to be based on lineage. It's not just for everyone who consider themselves to be Black. It's based on lineage. And then number 2, show people how they gave cash reparations to the Japanese Americans. Some people will say it should have been more than that. Point that I'm making is, was it divisive then? Or is it only divisive when it happens for Black people? We got to wake up, people. We got to wake up. So that's part of the reason why I do think some Black voters are choosing to support RFK Jr. because that has been going around on social media that he has a reparations plan. But if you actually look at it, it's not what we're owed. And it's not what reparation activists are asking for. Sorry. But to that point, he is gaining Black voters and Joe Biden is losing Black voters. Right now, if we're looking at the race for 2024, Joe Biden, Donald Trump, and RFK Jr. are likely to be on the debate stage. There's also this issue. Joe Biden is also losing support from Muslim voters. I forgot about this clip as well. So it's the Black community, it's the Muslim community, and also younger voters. So he's having a problem here, particularly in a state like Michigan. Let's get into this.
Back to our breaking news this morning. Sources just telling CNN a hostage deal announcement between Israel and Hamas could come as soon as today. It is unclear if that announcement happens, when the hostages would be released. But our reporting is that it would call for the release of 50 women and children being held by Hamas in exchange for a 4 to 5 day pause in fighting. This all comes as the White House is reacting to recent polling that shows President Biden losing support over his handling of the Israel-Hamas war. Listen to this from White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre yesterday.
But what I'll be very clear about is we're not going to govern by polls here. We're going to, or poll numbers. We're not going to change the minds of Americans. I get that. Americans are going to feel how they feel.
In terms of those feelings, the polls show a broad lack of support among several groups, but it's especially pronounced, as you can see, among young voters. This NBC News poll shows 70% of voters ages 18 to 34 disapprove of Biden's handling of the war. Joining us now, CNN Chief.
And we're not going to show this whole clip. I just wanted to show you this piece right here because I want to point something out. Between the ages of 18 to 34%, 70% disapprove of how Joe Biden is handling this war. And I also told you that RFK Jr. actually is gaining support. I think he has more support from that age group than Joe Biden does. And it makes you wonder, like, where are they going to? Now, what's weird is that RFK Jr.'s position on this conflict with Israel and Gaza is in agreement with Joe Biden. He agrees with sending the weapons to Israel. He agrees in not calling for a ceasefire. So what's really strange is that it's interesting that that demographic in particular is a plus for RFK Jr., considering he has the same principle about this as Joe Biden does. So what that tells me is that people are just not aware of his position on this issue because he hasn't been on as many shows to discuss Israel and Gaza. That's part of it. And then number two, people, again, are not paying attention to who RFK Jr. actually is, and they're just paying attention to the Kennedy name. And you'll see this as well when we come into this clip here from Meet the Press. When they talk about handling of Israel-Hamas war, you'll see what I mean.
Overall, this is the handling of the Israel-Hamas war. And again, it kind of measures overall up with Biden's foreign policy approval. But look at this. Among the oldest group of voters, 65 plus, there's a majority who approve of how Biden is handling this. That's plus 12. Look at the youngest group of voters. 20 approve, 70% disapprove. He is 50 points underwater with the youngest group of voters. That is a 62-point net swing between youngest and oldest on this topic of Israel and Hamas.
And let me pause there. So you guys see what I was referring to? So this right here is a big problem for Joe Biden, that 18 to 34 demographic. We do have to remember that young voters did show up in Georgia to support Joe Biden. They did help Joe Biden. I don't think Joe Biden will win Georgia again unless some type of a miracle were to happen. So for people just to discount those young voters, I do want to remind people about what happened in Georgia for 2020. But again, it is apparent to me that some of those voters from that age group are moving over towards an RFK Jr. But again, that tells me they're not fully aware of his position on this issue either. So there's a lot to be said there, but there's more that we really need to dig into because, like I said, I don't think everyone is paying attention to what RFK Jr. is saying. I think they're just fascinated by the Kennedy name. Now, some people are paying attention and they do support him, but I don't think everybody is paying attention to what's being said. Let's go to some of the comments. Thank you, Matt. Peace and love to Sabby and Eric. Thank you for what you are doing. Thank you, Mr. Matt. Jessica says, if he wasn't so pro-Israel, I would have voted for him. Yeah. For me, he'd have to have the right position on Israel and Gaza, which he does not have. And he said some horrific things about Palestinians that I do not approve of. And number two, I just showed you the mofo is against cash reparations because it might make other groups feel bad. I ain't got time for it. Next, Rick says reparations has to be specific. Yes, it does. Thank you, Jesse. Jill Stein should make Jesse Ventura her VP. I interviewed Jesse Ventura a while back. It's been a minute. I should invite him back on. Keith says Dr. West is for reparations. Yes, he is. And so is Jill. And so is Claudia. Thank you for the super sticker, Darnell Barnett, ED. EDD is in the house. And thank you for this super sticker as well, Darnell. Thank you, Janice. It's a debt owed for stolen labor. Yes, Thank you, Janice. Janice gets it. Sebastian says, where's the reparations for Haiti? Haiti would need to get reparations from France. No shade to my Haitian peeps, but Haiti would need to go to France and ask for reparations, which is weird because at one point, Haiti actually paid reparations to France. It's crazy. Deneen, it's not our fault you waited 150 years to pay your debt. Thank you, M. Smith. Companies are stealing labor right now. How many people do you know doing the work of numerous people at one job for one salary? We talked about that before. We talked about it was connected to quiet hiring. Thank you, Willis. Thank you for staying on code, Sabby. We're tired of the BS. Yes, we are. And thank you, Kushranada. So true that we have a blueprint to give Black reparations. I agree with that process, but how do we get past the whole, but you weren't a slave BS? Again, it's based on lineage, and it's about wealth and debt that was stolen that never was given the opportunity to be passed on to future generations. That's how I would frame it.